On a July morning in 1994 in Callaway County, Missouri, Marcus Webb stood in front of a tree stump and felt his entire career starting to come apart. 2 weeks earlier, this had seemed like a nothing problem. The 300-year-old oak was gone, cut down, hauled off, already turned into someone's custom furniture. All that was left was the stump, 8 feet across at the base, root system spreading 40 feet in every direction, thick as telephone poles near the center, branching and rebranching into thousands of smaller roots that had been gripping Missouri clay since before George Washington was born. 3 centuries of growth, 3 centuries of digging deeper. Marcus had figured his new Caterpillar 350 excavator would handle it in an afternoon. He had been wrong. That had been 2 weeks and $30,000 ago. Now Marcus stood at the edge of the job site with hydraulic fluid soaking into his $300 work boots, 3 burst hoses in a pile behind him, and a crew of 30 men who had stopped pretending to be busy with other things and were just openly watching their boss run out of options. The Caterpillar 350 sat 12 feet away with its arm hanging limp. A puddle of hydraulic fluid had spread beneath it in the Missouri clay and was attracting flies. 40 tons of machine, $400,000, financed over 7 years. And the stump hadn't moved 1 inch. Let me tell you about Marcus Webb. Because you can't understand what happened next until you understand the man who was standing there. Marcus was 42 years old and had built himself up from nothing in central Missouri. He'd started as a framing carpenter at 22, worked his way to site foreman, then project manager, then started his own company. Webb Development was now the biggest residential contractor in Callaway County, luxury subdivisions, custom homes, the kind of projects that made other builders' stomachs hurt with envy. Marcus had a particular genius for marketing. He drove a white Mercedes convertible with Webb Development painted on the doors. He wore designer clothes to job sites, not because he didn't know how to dress for mud and concrete, but because he understood that rich clients bought confidence as much as they bought houses. He brought those clients out to watch his equipment work, made a show of the massive machines moving earth, called himself the builder who gets it done. His competitors called him the showman. The Deer Creek Estates project was supposed to be Marcus's masterpiece. 50 luxury homes on 5-acre lots starting at $500,000. A gated community with a private lake, tennis courts, a clubhouse. The kind of development that would make Marcus Webb a name people in Missouri remembered for 20 years. The entrance road was the key to everything. It curved through a stand of mature hardwood trees, creating exactly the impression Marcus needed. Money, prestige, nature present but tamed. The design ran directly through where the old oak had stood. The tree itself had been no problem. Professional crew, specialized equipment, 2 days, gone. But the stump, that was a different conversation entirely. "We'll pull it out this weekend," Marcus had told his crew. "I'll bring the new cat." Should take maybe an hour. On the first day, Marcus drove the excavator himself. He wanted to show the crew how it was done, demonstrate the raw, overwhelming capability of modern equipment against this ancient obstacle. He positioned the machine, extended the boom, wrapped the bucket around the base of the stump, and engaged the hydraulics. The excavator groaned. The tracks tore at the clay. The engine screamed. The stump did not move. Marcus pushed harder. The hydraulic lines began to whine at a pitch that an experienced operator would have recognized immediately as a warning. Marcus was not an experienced operator. He was a salesman who knew how to drive heavy equipment badly. The first hose blew at 3:47 in the afternoon. A gunshot sound, hydraulic fluid spraying across the machine and across Marcus's designer jeans. "Get the spare hoses," Marcus said. His face was red. "We'll fix it and try again." They fixed it. They tried again. A second hose blew. They fixed that one too, brought in a bulldozer to push while the excavator pulled. The bulldozer's track spinning uselessly in the clay while the excavator strained against its limits. A third hose blew. Now it was 2 weeks later. The stump sat exactly where it had always been. $30,000 in repairs and delays. The buyers for Phase 1 were closing in October. The road had to be poured by September. They were in real trouble. Marcus stood with his site foreman, Dean Curtis, running through options they both already knew didn't work. Dynamite. The county would never permit it near the property line. Chemical dissolvers, 6 months minimum. Manual labor, 40 men, 3 weeks, $250,000. And they still might not be able to move the center mass because the taproot went down at least 15 feet. They stood in the July heat looking at the stump like it was a fortress they couldn't breach. That's when the old Caterpillar 20 came clanking up the access road. Now let me tell you about Chester Holloway, because this story is really about Chester, not the stump. Chester was 71 years old and had farmed 320 acres on the edge of the Deer Creek development for 45 years. His family had farmed that land before him. He'd watched the bulldozers arrive 6 months earlier and clear the fields that had been his neighbor's farm for 3 generations. He'd kept his mouth shut when the construction traffic tore up the county road he used every day. Said nothing when the grading dust settled on his corn. Chester Holloway was not a complainer. He was a watcher. And for 2 weeks he had been watching Marcus Webb throw expensive equipment at an oak stump and lose. He'd watched from his fence line every morning, watched the first hose blow, watched the second, watched the recovery company come out and leave without solving anything, watched the bulldozer spin its tracks in the clay, watched Marcus on his cell phone and in his Mercedes, and standing with his hands on his hips staring at the stump like staring hard enough might make it move. Chester had been pulling stumps since he was 14 years old, not with excavators. There were no excavators when Chester was learning, not with hydraulics. He'd grown up with chains and pulleys and the patient application of physics, the way his father Emmett had taught him. Emmett Holloway had bought the Caterpillar 20 crawler tractor in 1932 during the worst year of the Depression, paid $800 for it, used 2 years old, and it had been the most expensive purchases of his life. But Emmett had watched what the little crawler could do, and he knew it would pay for itself. The Cat 20 weighed about 5,000 pounds and made perhaps 25 horsepower at the drawbar. Compared to Marcus Webb's Excavator, it was a toy, but it had been designed for exactly one thing: pulling. Pulling plows through heavy soil, pulling stumps from fields being cleared, pulling loads that horses couldn't move. Chester had watched his father use it for 20 years. He'd taken it over when Emmett died in 1967 and had been using it ever since. Not for everything, but for the jobs where nothing else worked. He had been waiting 2 weeks for this moment, the moment when the showman finally ran out of show. The sound arrived before the machine did, a metallic clanking, rhythmic and slow, like the heartbeat of something that had been beating for 60 years and saw no reason to stop. Then the Cat 20 came over the rise, small by any modern standard, maybe 8 feet long, painted a rust orange that had faded over 6 decades to the color of dried blood. Steel tracks, not rubber, that made the earth tremble slightly with each rotation. Chester, sitting in the open operator's seat, no cab, no air conditioning, nothing between him and the Missouri July sun. Behind the crawler, a trailer loaded with chains, pulleys, cable, and wooden blocks. Equipment that looked like it had been pulled from a museum basement. "What the hell's that?" Marcus said. "That's Chester Holloway's tractor," Dean Curtis said quietly. "He farms the land next door. It looks like it belongs in a scrapyard." Before anyone could move, Chester had stopped the crawler at the edge of the work area. He climbed down with the careful movements of a 71-year-old man who had learned which joints to trust and which to negotiate with, and walked toward Marcus with the unhurried stride of someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. "Morning," Chester said. Marcus crossed his arms. "Site's closed. Insurance liability. I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor." Chester looked at the stump, then at the excavator with its dead arm and its puddle of hydraulic fluid. "Saw you've been having some trouble with that oak. We've got it handled." Chester looked at the stump. His expression didn't change by a single degree. "Looked like it," he said. "Is there something you wanted? Thought I might be able to help." "I've pulled a few stumps in my time." Marcus laughed. "It started small and got bigger and meaner. As it built, the construction workers nearby stopped working to watch." "You thought you might help," Marcus repeated. "With that?" He pointed at the Cat 20. "That thing weighs what, 2 tons? About that. My excavator weighs 40 tons. My bulldozer weighs 30. Together they couldn't move that stump an inch." He shook his head. "And you think your antique toy is going to do what $500,000 in equipment couldn't?" Chester didn't respond to the laughter. He looked at the stump the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, studying it, reading it, understanding it. Your machines are stronger than mine, Chester said, but strength isn't the problem. The problem is application. Marcus stopped laughing just enough to say, application? You're trying to rip that stump out all at once. Hydraulics push and pull in straight lines. They're built for lifting, for digging, but a stump like this isn't held by one force. It's held by thousands of roots, each one anchored in a different direction. You can't beat all those forces at once. You have to beat them one at a time. And how do you propose to do that? Mechanical advantage. Pulleys. Patience. Chester nodded toward his trailer. I've got a block and tackle system that multiplies pulling force by a factor of 6. My crawler makes 25 horsepower at the drawbar. With the pulleys, that becomes effectively 150 pounds of force per pound of pulling force applied slowly and steadily from the right angle. That's still less than my excavator makes. No, but it's applied differently. Your excavator makes its power in bursts. Hydraulic pressure builds, hits its limit, and either something moves or something breaks. My system doesn't have a limit. It just keeps pulling until the roots give up, one at a time. Marcus looked at the stump, then at his broken machine, then at his crew, all 30 of them watching, waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be in this moment. His pride said send the old man away. His schedule said he had run completely out of other options. Fine, Marcus said. Show me what your museum piece can do, but when it breaks down trying, you haul it off my site yourself. Chester nodded once, then he went to work. Let me tell you about the setup, because this is where 60 years of knowledge looks different from 2 weeks of expensive failure. Chester didn't touch a single chain for the first hour. He walked around the stump slowly, studying it from every angle, kneeling to examine exposed roots, pushing a steel rod into the ground at different points to measure depth and resistance. He mapped the root system in his head the way a surgeon maps a body before making the first cut. Marcus retreated to his Mercedes. Air conditioning, phone calls, or the pretense of phone calls. When Chester was satisfied with his examination, he began unloading the trailer. The block and tackle system looked primitive, a series of cast iron pulleys connected by chain, the kind of equipment that belonged in a photograph from 1935. But Chester assembled it with the efficiency of a man who had done this particular setup perhaps 100 times. Each pulley placed at a specific calculated angle. Each chain attached to a specific root or exposed section of trunk, not at random, but at the precise point where that chain would apply maximum leverage against that specific section of root system. He drove steel anchor stakes into the ground 30 feet from the stump in 3 different directions, ran chains from the anchors through the pulleys to the stump. When he was done, the stump was wrapped in a web of iron. 8 separate attachment points, 8 separate pulleys, each one aimed at a different section of the root system. One of the construction workers who had been watching walked over. What is all this? Physics, Chester said. The roots on the north side are shallower. I'm going to pull those first, pop them free one at a time. Then I'll shift to the east side, then west. South side last. By the time I get to the south, the stump won't have enough left to hold on. How long? Chester looked at the stump and then at the sky. 4 hours if nothing breaks. The worker laughed. Marcus has been at this for 2 weeks. Marcus has been fighting the whole stump at once. I'm going to take it apart piece by piece. Chester climbed onto the Cat 20, started the engine, and let it warm up. The old motor coughed twice and then found its rhythm. Not smooth the way a modern engine is smooth, but consistent and dependable. The sound of something that had been doing its job for 60 years and knew exactly how. He engaged the clutch and moved forward, taking the slack out of the first chain. The chain went taut. The pulleys creaked. The crawler's steel tracks bit into the clay. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then Chester saw it. A tremor in the soil on the north side of the stump. A hairline crack in the clay running from the stump outward. Somewhere 3 feet underground, the first root was starting to move. He kept the throttle exactly where it was. The crawler pulled. The pulleys multiplied. Then, with a sound like a very large knuckle cracking, the first root broke free. The construction crew that had been watching with skeptical amusement went completely quiet. Chester didn't celebrate. He didn't acknowledge the sound or look around to gauge the reaction. He disengaged the clutch, repositioned the chain to the next attachment point, and began pulling again. another root, another crack, another piece of the stump's grip on the earth broken. For the first hour, Marcus stayed in his Mercedes. When the first root broke, he got out and walked closer with his arms crossed, face carefully skeptical. When the third root broke, Marcus stopped crossing his arms. When the fifth broke, he started pacing. By the time Chester had worked his way to the east side of the stump, Marcus was standing at the edge of the work area, with his mouth slightly open. The stump was moving. Not much. An inch, a slight tilt, but it was moving. After 2 weeks of absolute resistance, the ancient oak was finally giving ground. "How is this possible?" Marcus said to Dean Curtis beside him. "My excavator makes 10 times the horsepower." "He's not using horsepower," Dean said. "He's using leverage." "It's the same thing." "No, it isn't." Dean watched Chester reset the chains for the west side. "Your excavator applies force in one direction. It's like trying to open a locked door by pushing harder. Chester's working the hinges. He's taking the door apart piece by piece." 3 hours and 47 minutes after Chester started pulling, the sun was dropping toward the western horizon, and the stump sat in a crater of disturbed earth, tilted at 20 degrees, most of its root system already broken and lying exposed in the clay around it. Only the deepest roots on the south side still held. Chester stopped the crawler and climbed down. He walked to the stump, examined it, kicked at the remaining roots with his boot. Then he went back to the trailer and pulled out one final chain, links the size of a man's fist, heavier than anything else on the trailer. "This is the main pull," Chester said, to no one in particular. "Deep roots are all that's left. One good pull ought to do it." He wrapped the heavy chain around the center of the stump, ran it through the last pulley arrangement, connected it to the crawler, climbed into the seat, engaged the clutch, pushed the throttle all the way forward. The Cat 20 dug in. Its steel tracks churned the Missouri clay. The 62-year-old engine gave everything it had, 25 horsepower multiplied by 6, applied through 6 decades of iron and chain and the accumulated understanding of how stubborn things give way. The chain went tight as a piano wire. The stump groaned. Then, with a sound like thunder coming from underground, the last roots let go. The stump rose out of the earth, 300 years of growth, 40 feet of root system, 15 feet of depth, all of it coming up at once, trailing clay and rocks and broken root ends in every direction, and then it cleared the hole and rolled onto its side, and the construction site went absolutely silent. Chester climbed down from the Cat 20 and walked to the hole. He looked at it for a moment, nodded once, then turned and began coiling up his chains. The construction crew erupted. Men cheering, men slapping each other, men pointing at the stump and the hole in the ancient orange crawler that had done what $400,000 of modern equipment couldn't do. Marcus Webb didn't cheer. He stood at the edge of the crater, looking down into the hole where the stump had been, face pale, hands not entirely steady. Chester finished coiling his chains and walked over. "There's your hole," Chester said. "Should be able to pour your road now." Marcus finally looked at him, a long moment where neither man said anything. "How?" Marcus finally said. "How did you do that?" "Same way my father did it. Same way his father did before him." Chester looked at the crawler. "Some problems don't need more power. They need better thinking. But your equipment is designed for different work. Digging, lifting, moving loose material. It's not built for pulling something that has decided it's not going to move." Chester patted the side of the Cat 20. "This machine was built for exactly one thing, pulling. My father paid $800 for it in 1932. Most expensive thing he ever owned. He used to say modern machines were built for speed, but his crawler was built for stubborn." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "I owe you," he said. "Name your price." Chester shook his head. "I didn't do this for money. I did it because that stump was aggravating me, sitting there acting like it was smarter than everybody." He paused, "and because my father would have wanted me to. He believed that if you could help someone, you should. Didn't matter whether they deserved it. I laughed at you in front of my whole crew. You did. And you still needed the help." Chester turned and walked back to his crawler. Marcus called after him, "Wait. There has to be something." Chester thought for a moment. "You're building 50 houses here, nice houses for people with money who probably don't know what real work looks like." He looked at the field around them. "This land was farmed for 150 years before you got to it. Put up a sign at the entrance where that stump used to be. Something that tells people who worked this ground before the lawns and the tennis courts? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. I can do that. Then we're even. Chester engaged the clutch and drove his crawler back down the access road, the steel tracks clanking, the old engine coughing and sputtering the way it had for 60 years. Marcus Webb finished the Deer Creek Estates development 6 months later on time and on budget. At the entrance, where the oak stump had been, he installed a stone marker. The inscription read, "This land was farmed by the Harrison family from 1847 to 1994. Before the houses were built, there were crops. Before the lawns were planted, there were fields. The people who worked this ground built it with their hands, their backs, and their stubborn determination. We honor their memory." The Homeowners Association wanted to remove it. Marcus refused. "That sign stays," he told them. "It's in the deed restrictions." Something had changed in Marcus Webb after that July afternoon. He still drove the Mercedes, still wore the good clothes to job sites, still called himself the builder who gets it done, but he started keeping a photograph on his desk, a picture Chester had given him of Emmett Holloway standing next to the Cat 20 in 1935, thin, weathered, proud. The crawler behind him looked exactly the same as it had 60 years later when it pulled the stump. When people asked about the photo, Marcus told the whole story, including the part where he'd laughed, including the part where he'd called Chester's machine junk. "I learned that expensive doesn't mean better," Marcus would say. "That new doesn't mean smarter. That sometimes the old ways work when nothing else does." He started hiring older contractors, men who remembered how things worked before hydraulics and computers. Started keeping simpler equipment around for the jobs that didn't need complexity. And every time someone told him a problem was impossible, he thought of Chester Holloway in the Cat 20. "Nothing is impossible," he'd say. "You just haven't found the right approach yet." Chester kept farming until 1998, when his knees gave out and his son Robert finally convinced him to retire. He sold most of his equipment, but kept the Cat 20 in the same barn where Emmett had parked it. After the stump story spread out, and it did spread because rural communities move stories like weather, people drove out to his farm just to see the crawler, to hear Chester tell it in his own words. Chester always told it the same way, always ended with the same thing. My father used to say people get confused about what makes machines powerful. They think it's horsepower, its size, it's how much force you can generate, but that's not power. Power is applying force effectively. A lever is more powerful than a hammer. A pulley is more powerful than a rope. And patience is more powerful than strength. Chester Holloway died in 2006 at age 83. His funeral at the Methodist Church in Fulton drew over 200 people. Marcus Webb flew back from Arizona specifically to be there. At the reception, Marcus found Robert Holloway and handed him an envelope. $50,000. "That's too much," Robert said. "Your father saved my business that day. Maybe saved my whole career. $50,000 is the minimum." He paused. "Send it to the County Historical Society, the people who preserve old equipment and teach kids how things used to work," with a note that it came from the machine I called junk. In 2015, 21 years after Chester pulled the oak stump, Robert Holloway received a call. A developer named James Webb, Marcus's son, was building a new subdivision on the outskirts of Fulton. There was a stump, a century-old elm in the path of the entrance road. James had brought in an excavator and a bulldozer. 3 days in, the stump hadn't moved. Robert drove the Cat 20 to the site. James Webb watched it come up the access road from inside his truck. He climbed out slowly. "What is that?" The site foreman didn't look up from his clipboard. "That's the Holloway crawler. You don't know the story." "What story?" "Ask your father." Robert climbed down from the Cat 20 and walked over. He extended his hand. "You must be Marcus's boy. You look just like him. Do I know you?" "No, but your father knew mine. We had a situation with a stump about 20 years ago." Robert nodded toward the elm. "Looks like history repeating itself. Can you help?" Robert looked at the stump, then at the broken hydraulic line dripping from James's excavator. "Probably. But first you need to do something." "What?" "Call your father. Put it on speaker. I want him to hear this." James dialed. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring. "Dad, I've got a man here named Robert Holloway. He says, you know him. A long pause. Robert, Marcus said, is that your father's crawler I hear running in the background? It is. And my son has a stump he can't move? He does. Marcus Webb laughed, not the laugh he'd used in 1994. This was different. The laughter of a man who has learned something true and is watching someone else learn it for the first time. Pull it out for him, Robert. Make sure he watches every minute of it. Make sure he understands. Robert pulled the elm stump out in 2 hours and 43 minutes. Afterward, James Webb stood beside the Cat 20 and looked at it the way his father had looked at it in 1994. How, James said, how does an 80-year-old machine do what mine can't? Robert looked at him. Because it doesn't know how to stop. Your machines are smarter and faster and better at most things. But they know when to quit. They're engineered to know when to quit. This machine doesn't have that. It just pulls. And some problems don't need smart. They need stubborn. The 1932 Caterpillar 20 is still in the Holloway family barn in Callaway County, Missouri. Robert starts it on the first Sunday of every month. He still takes calls about stumps and stuck equipment and problems that modern machines have given up on. He never says no. His daughter Emma learned to drive it on her 16th birthday, the fourth generation of the Holloway family to sit in that open operator's seat. No cab, no air conditioning, nothing between them and the work. Marcus Webb is retired now in Arizona. He still tells a story when he meets someone in construction who is frustrated with an impossible problem. He tells the whole thing, the Mercedes, the designer jeans, the hydraulic fluid on his $300 boots, the part where he laughed. Expensive doesn't mean better, he says every time. New doesn't mean smarter, and sometimes, for the problems that are really stubborn, the ones that have had 100 years to decide they're not moving, sometimes what you need isn't more power. Sometimes you need an old man in an open seat with no computer telling him when to stop. The Cat 20 has been in the Holloway barn for over 90 years. It will probably be there for 90 more, and every time someone stands in front of an impossible problem and says their equipment can't handle it, somewhere in Callaway County, Missouri, an engine starts.